Thank you for coming, everybody. Today I decided to not bring notes. That I always rely on notes when I introduce somebody, but I decided that if I couldn't introduce my own husband without notes, then I'm really not worth my salt. But it will be a very brief introduction. Today we have with us Brian Schneider, who is a senior lecturer at Bentley University in the Economics department. He obtained his undergraduate degree at Kenyon in Ohio, and then went on to do his graduate work at the New School of Social Research. And when he's not lecturing, he is at home in Bolton with his lovely wife and even lovelier Australian Shepherd. And
not
today,
necessarily in that order.
And so today he will be discussing the Green New Deal. And I hope that what Bobby Robinson told me is true, and that there will be some questions afterwards, since the Climate Initiative group was going to be discussing this among themselves. So we will welcome questions after his talk. All right. And I hope you'll help me welcome Brian Schneider.
So again, as I talk, start formulating good questions. If you can, quote, stump the chump, if you can come up with something that say I have to get back at you, I don't know, we need a door prize for that or something like that, but come up with some good questions. I'm going to aim at a half hour, but it'll turn into 20 minutes, since I seem to have no problem of coming up with words in excess. So I'll, at the very end, we'll open for questions and think of some good ones. This is a fascinating topic. Once again, it is timely and it is pressing. And as I'd mentioned to the men's breakfast and other talks that I've given here, this is one topic I've kind of skirted and avoided deliberately. And the reason is that when I give a talk, I kind of like to leave where people kind of feel positive and good. What is the expression? Don't leave them on a bummer, leave them laughing, you know? And this is a topic that is really not conducive to it. There's an enormous amount of potential dread and negativity involved with this, because this really is one of the premier issues of our time. And more importantly, as you can see with a lot of young people these days, they're starting to realize that this is the world that they're going to be living in, and that they are becoming active accordingly, because they see where this is heading. The subject of global warming and or of climate change, this is actually not new. You can go all the way back to the 1880s, 1890s with early geologists asking a very simple question: is there limits to coal? Is there limits to hydrocarbons? Early on, before there was the official British Coal Board, they were talking about this subject. The early papers of the U.S. Geological Survey also brought up the question of carbon and possibilities of, is there a limit to the burning of carbon? Now, once again, up until relatively recent, it's no, we can burn and we can as much as coal as we can, and it is the basis of what became the Industrial Revolution, both the first Industrial Revolution, then the second Industrial Revolution. Coal as the energy product that drove this thing was indeed the energy of choice. Unfortunately, it continued of recent with rapid industrialization in places like China, but also there was a rather Faustian bargain done in India of recent, where they doubled down on coal as opposed to alternatives. And if anyone's been following the heat in India this summer, it is dreadful. And more importantly, urban areas, which is an area of an acute problem. So people have been aware that hydrocarbons might have adverse consequences. When I was a young undergraduate, I was driving out to central Montana to dig up my fossils for the summer, and my mentor, who was a professor of biology and zoology at Adelphi University, and I had about a 7-state battle over the relative dangers between nuclear power and or the burning of coal and hydrocarbons. It finished at a draw when we arrived, But needless to say, there was an awful lot of material. And I don't think I fully appreciated his argument until a few years ago when I started realizing exactly that he had indeed got the parameters right, that carbon really is a game changer when it comes to life on the planet and the workings of this planet. You see in the geological record different periods of time where the composition of the atmosphere changes, and it has rather interesting results. Some can be positive, big dinosaurs and a lot of growth, and some's quite negative, which means extinctions of various capacities. But so this debate's been there. Now, as far as what will turn into a Green Deal or sort of the green economics of the present, policy-wise and other, there's a group of rather forward-thinking, I believe there were some form of physical scientists, the Lovins, Amory and I think his wife or vice versa, I keep mixing them up. But they started this concept back in the 70s of hard paths, hydrocarbon paths, and green paths. The idea is that sooner or later that as a planet, any sort of human growth and industrial activity is going to have to shift to a sustainable form of energy. You can start the industrial, we started the Industrial Revolution with hydrocarbons, but you're going to need to be able to then segue into something that is going to have less of a negative consequence. And this is where the idea of green paths, and this is at a time that things like wind and solar were exotics. But even at this time, it said you have to come up with something else, because the net effect of all of these hydrocarbons will create a condition of warming, and this condition of warming will change the facts on the ground of both climate, but things, weather, sea levels, and a whole series of things that are interrelated. A true Pandora's box of problems coming out of increased warming. So in the 70s, so we sort of knew about it, but as they say that we kicked the can down the road. We didn't do anything about it. And it's interesting. How many of you have an association with MIT? Okay. Reference to the late great Jay Forster, okay? Engineers love to get stuff done. And natural scientists like good, concise answers, and then when you have a problem, you solve it. I don't know, maybe it's a German thing for me, but you solve a problem. There's a problem, you figure out what it is, and you solve it. The problem with this is that this problem is one where there has very, very powerful vested interests. And also the time frame. There's not an immediate type of compelling reason. We feel it when we get a big storm. When someone gets inundated, whether it's New Orleans or something up the coast, or whether we have a drought, or whether we have hail the size of bricks, all sorts of curious things. We say, oh my, I didn't see that one coming. But a lot of people in the scientific community saw this coming. And this is not new. People have been jumping up and down and saying, hey folks, you got to do something about this. Now, many of you are familiar with putting off, I refer to as required maintenance. If any of you had an automobile, you know that old thing where you're driving along and enjoying life, and one of those warning lights goes on, and you ignore it. I always keep a little roll of electrical tape. I just cover up the warning light. Out of sight, out of mind, right? And then a second warning light comes on, and it's like, that's okay, I got plenty more tape where that comes from. And you keep going and going and going until all of a sudden the car is really doing weird stuff, and it's smoke coming out, etc. But there's no need to panic quite yet. It's still moving. That's sort of where we're at. And unfortunately, so many of the damn warning lights on our dashboard are flashing. And we're running out of time. And this is the immediacy of it. And this is why coming out of 2007, 2008, first a bunch of economists and folks out of the UK started coming up with this idea of the Green New Deal formally as policy. And then it washes back to this coast where a lot of people have been working on this for a while and bringing it up. The idea is that we're running out of time. We've been kicking the can down the road so darn long that we're starting to run out of road. And you're going to have to deal with it. The longer you put this off, also the more expensive and the more acute the solution has to be. It's like that thing you're always warned by your parents, you know, a stitch in time saves 9. You know, a little bit of maintenance is always good, but you put it off, you put it off, you put it off, and you find yourself coming up against stuff. Also, you're not really sure because you discover that what you think is static is in fact dynamic. In fact, that you find self-reinforcing effects leading to accelerations where you didn't expect it, okay? For any of you who have a background in the natural sciences, it's absolutely fascinating to discover empirically what you don't know. Because when it happens, it's all of a sudden like, I didn't see that one coming, oops, okay? And we're seeing this in a whole different areas. Now, before I dive in and start pulling this apart, there's always been a tension between the science and the economists. Now, I think I would define myself as a self-hating economist. I've made a career of taking my discipline to the mat for all of its inadequacies and arrogance. But with that said, is that you find right now this dynamic where you have on one side climate scientists who have been working on this thing, et cetera, and they're laying it out, okay, this is what's happening, this is what's happening, this is what's happening. Well, on the economic side are the ones that say, oh yeah, great, but it'll just cost too much. Here, we'll do the numbers, we'll count the beans. Now, if any of you ever had any intimate experience with economists, they like to count, but they count on their own terms. The devil in the detail, and this is really important for a social science, it's all in the assumptions. And when you can figure out what to count and what not to count, you can skew your results. So you say, oh, what you're suggesting is incredibly expensive. We can't afford that. Because remember, in economics, neoclassical economics, you reduce everything to a simple relationship. This is the marginal cost of the action equal the marginal benefit from that action. And you weigh the two together. If the benefit's greater than the cost, you do it, just like Nike. If the cost is greater than the marginal benefit of the policy, then you don't do it. It's very, very simple. Jeremy Bentham would have been proud of this binary type of situation. But with that simplification, it's just that, simplification. It's what do you count and what do you not count. Now I have to say, this is really fascinating, and from all the despair, there are little bits of encouragement. This last few days it came out that Moody's, the bond people, et cetera, and their intelligence division, have finally started to do the numbers of what is going to be the economic cost, you know, the cost of not doing anything as far as increasing the climate. So we're talking about increasing the global temperature by 1.5 Celsius. You go 1.5 Celsius, what will be the effect? Well, they found by the year 2100, they gave the number of 69 trillion. That's with the T, not the B. Now, it's amusing. I had a colleague of mine at Wheaton College who did a piece about a year ago where one of the people saying, well, anything like a Green New Deal, it's just too darn expensive. Look at these numbers. And once again, if the cost is greater than the benefit, you don't do it. So we can't do it because the cost is too great. Well, it says, well, what are you counting? Now, trust me, Moody's was extremely conservative in what they were counting. And even they were saying this is significant. Because what you're doing is you're fundamentally altering the planet per se. Okay? So once again, this is an issue, and even people that have, with eyes wide shut, have been trying to avoid this issue. You can't, because we're running out of road. This is what's making this compelling, as well as, once again, the kids. It's her name, Greta, is a personal hero of mine, that the kids are actually starting to take this serious, because it appears that the adults have failed. Okay. Green New Deal, GND, and it came back 2007, 2008. The particular structure of it was a way to put a adrenaline shot into global climate and global warming type of policy. AOC, Bernie, our very own Markey, our senator, as such, were the people that shepherded the first formal type of proposals through the Congress and the Senate as such. But there have been a lot of folks that have been working on this subject for quite a while. At UMass Amherst, they have my dear colleague Bob Poland's been at this for a while. And in fact, a number of years back in the 90s, we were working on this at TELUS Institute out of Boston, and some of the folks at Tufts University at GDAY, Global Development and Economics at Tufts. So they've been laying out this policy guidelines, et cetera, since way before this became formal as such. So the idea is to, by packaging it as a New Deal. New Deal. Now the most immediate thing is we look back, well, what is a New Deal? Well, we look at it in its historical context, which is of course FDR and the New Deal. Well, what was that issue? You had a local issue and you had a global issue. You had a local issue, which was the Great Depression. And the global issue was, it was now a global depression. So what you needed to do was to act locally to be able to deal with the Great Depression. And you had to do it in such a way that wasn't just one or two particular things, but a whole series of interconnected areas. And this is what is fascinating about this Green New Deal. This isn't just a one-note symphony of just carbon, 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 carbon. It's having to deal with how do you fundamentally change an economic system based on carbon. We are based geographically on the internal combustion engine. I teach a class in urban and regional economics, and the way we are just physically dispersed, geographically dispersed, just based on the automobile. Cheap gas means suburbs. Okay? And you invert that when the price of energy goes up, urbanization starts to have its merits. Okay? We find ourselves actually in a period of time globally, as well as in the United States, where urbanization is accelerating. Okay? The future is urban. And what you see is that it's not neutral. As the future urbanizes, you find that rural communities start to dry up and blow away. And so it's an interesting sort of, not a zero-sum game here, but what you find is that the acceleration of the urbanization is a centripetal effect of pulling toward, especially coastal. The Midwest is still sort of a dead zone, but coastal cities is the place where the growth is at. An interesting thing, because now the climate change has a dire effect when it comes to cities and urbanizations. I mentioned earlier about India, that India having heat issues. One of the problems, and I'll be dealing with this in classes I'm teaching this fall, is that cities have to be able to deal with an unanticipated consequence of this climate change. How do you deal with heat? Anyone want to guess what the other urban issue will be? We've got heat, flooding, inundation, okay? So it's a 1-2 punch. You've got a rising sea levels, you've got problems as far as water, because the water now is going to be affected by salinization, and then you have heat. In Bentley University, our graduates walk the plank and they get their diplomas, and they're given like 6 great superpowers. And one of the Bentley superpowers is to be nimble, quick on your feet. Cities are going to have to be nimble as far as rapid adaptation to these problems. So the most immediate thing is going to be heat, but the thing that's lurking, especially with coastals, whether you're Manhattan or even Boston, et cetera, is you have to be thinking about water level, ocean levels and inundation. So the question is now that not a question of if, it's a question of when and how quickly you'll be able to adapt to these particular changing conditions. So we can't, I mentioned we're running out of road. The current thing that we're doing just is not sustainable. We can't basically say, oh, well, you know, we can get another 2 or 3 miles out of this car before it goes, and after that I don't care, I'll just take the plates and walk away. I'm saying with this planet, folks, there's no planet B. I love that little expression. Because when we mess this up, we really mess it up. And a lot of people are suggesting, well, what about Mars? Well, it's a little premature perhaps, and you know, I don't know. Maybe I'm kind of an earthy kind of guy. I just kind of like our own 6 billion years of evolution's got me kind of right in the right place on this planet, and I don't know about doing Mars. Anyway, so we have this thing, and the idea of it is that, and it's funny, the Green Party in this country actually had this as a policy plank for well before that. It was back in the 90s that this became a policy plank. Okay, and in Europe, especially with stronger green parties like in Germany and Sweden and places like that, this has also been a central part of their thing. Now, what makes a green deal a new deal is that it's not just, once again, focusing on carbon. That's a huge part of it, but the interconnectivity of everything around that is such. As with the old New Deal, it was dealing with the Great Depression, but it dealt with it on a whole series of other levels, other series of factors, okay? It had to deal with mass unemployment. It had to deal with people's uncertainty and anxieties. It had to deal with problems of expenditure and the problems of just idleness, etc. And you saw multiple institutions come out of the New Deal, from the National Recovery Act, Works Project Administration, Civilian Conservation Corps, a whole series of these things were happening. And the idea is, once again, to, on a number of different levels, to be able to attempt to get the car out of the ditch, to attempt to address the problem. Well, the problem, the most focused problem, is that you got to start acting now and aggressively, or else you're going to miss that 1.5 degrees Celsius tipping point. Once you go past that 1.5 degrees Celsius tipping point, you start getting a series of self-reinforcing effects, which makes it next to impossible to be able to reverse it. And you've heard the expression runaway trains. When you get a train whose brakes might be a little iffy, when you reach a certain weight and a certain amount of velocity, those brakes can't stop your train. And more importantly, actually, in this case, what you find is an acceleration. You go above 1.5 degrees Celsius, you're going to have problems with ice cap, or if you see that being decimated. The biggie to watch is the Greenland ice cap and the stability of that, and go south, the Antarctica, okay? Both of those are highly destabilized right now. We have a real problem with the Greenland ice cap, because that has problems with the conveyor and our climate based on the Gulf Stream. We lose that ice cap, it changes the salinity of the water, and all of a sudden the conveyor stops. We lose the entire weather patterns, the thing that drove weather nicely. Now that's the kind of stuff that, you know, climatologists tell their children to scare them to go to bed, okay? Because it is thoroughly terrifying. Other problems is that the natural sense, and this is the fascinating thing about it, is that slight changes in temperature have affect both natural systems and inorganic systems. Changes in ocean temperature have remarkable impacts on a whole series of things, not just the lungs of the world. We think it's the Amazon, and no, it's the oceans. You kill the oceans, good luck on breathing. And more importantly, as the water temperature goes up, what you find is the acidity starts to increase, you get the bleaching of corals, etc. That is something really hard to turn around. The effect on planktons and the entire food chain, the base of the food chain is stressed, and everything starts to come apart accordingly. Highly unnerving, okay? The other problem is, I mentioned the conveyor that drives the weather both in North America and Europe, when that collapses. But the other problem is that as the thermocline decreases, if the water temperature increases, that warmer water starts to push deeper and deeper and deeper. What had happened over the millennia is that carbon, but particularly methanes, had been turned from a gas into a solids. You have methane ices that are stored underneath the kind of loose soil within certain levels of the deep. When the warm water comes in, these masses of methane become unstable and they erupt. Okay? Now, what's fascinating is when they erupt, they do it explosively. There's been some talk about, you know, you've heard of stories about the Bermuda Triangle and ships disappearing and aliens involved, obviously, because the only logical solution to a ship disappearing must be aliens. It turns out that they have had multiple ships actually had the poor luck to actually be over one of these shelves of methane ice that goes critical. And when the bubbles come up as it explodes into gas, the surface tension of the water collapses, which means the boat violently goes right to the bottom, just boom. Okay? So it disappears. You don't even have time to radio out. That's how quickly a boat can collapse in the situation. There's 2 or 3 shelves off of Massachusetts that actually have collapsed in the last few years. And this has added methane. Now, when you're looking at greenhouse gases, CO2 is the biggie, but methane is one of those things. There's a cluster of gases known affectionately as the greenhouse gases. Methane is really particularly nasty because it's got about 7 times the heat holding properties as CO2. That's one thing. When the oceans heat up, that methane is released. Anyone want to guess where the other great location of methane that we have to worry about?
Tundra.
Coming on?
Tundra.
The tundra! Maybe you've heard of this place called Siberia in northern Canada, etc. Well, there's a great thing about tundra is that it keeps locked up some nasties. It keeps a lot of nasty viruses that used to plague elephants and woolly mammoths and stuff. It keeps it under there. But it locks an enormous amount of CO2 as well as an enormous amount of methane in a solid form. That melts, it releases. 4 or 5 years ago, I saw a picture that came out of the international press of somewhere in Siberia. It looked like a crater. But you look closely at the crater, and you suddenly realize that it's not boom, it's boom. It's something underneath exploding. And what it was, I'm trying to be genteel about this, but an enormous release of methane. And that's what you see as the permafrost melts. The solid turns into a gas and it releases as such. And this is an extremely dangerous accelerant when it comes to heating. Methane is something that is really to be watched. And once this thing, as it heats up, you get more and more permafrost failing, more and more of this stuff in the ocean, these shelves of solid, of ice, methane ice, when they collapse, they release, and they create then even more heat and even more things. So it tumbles forward. As it warms up, the pace of the warming tumbles forward, and you get an exponential increase of the effect. Runaway train, okay? Just terrifying. Okay? And again, if you're paying attention, you should be horrified. All right. What this Green New Deal is about is taking the issue, but instead of allowing it to be given, quote, to the experts, shunted off and say, we'll get to it, don't worry, you know, I've got a white lab coat, or, you know, I've got the proper lobbyists, we'll take care of this. No, it's opening it up, but realizing that there's multiple areas. Just like with the old New Deal, there's multiple areas to be addressed as far as policy. So, a few of these things. One, as part of the Green New Deal, a massive investment in renewable energy. This is back to that green path of the Lovins, okay? Wind and solar, but also you can go geothermal. You can go a little bit of kind of hydro, but we're moving away from big dams to more sort of mini hydro, more effective as such. It's been remarkable, and once again, to the MIT folks, congratulations. The technologies for these renewables have become cost effective. Coal is dead, period. It ain't coming back. It cannot come back. Anyone want to guess what killed coal?
Oil.
Not so much oil, but keep going.
Gas.
You're barking up the right frack. Exactly, fracked gas. Because when you take a look at energy production, in the United States, we deregulated the energy industry. So we separated production from distribution to consumption and marketing per se. Okay, the whole deregulation process as such. So now you're looking at areas that have bottlenecks or problems as far as on the generation side. So they're looking for plants that are not going to be large, are going to be small. Remember that N word again, nimble? That for energy right now, if there is a demand for energy and the local supply is a little iffy, the only way that a new firm can really come in is if the size is right, scale, and then the relative cost structures of being able to get that capacity in, get it up and running, and the deliverable as quickly as possible. That's not happening with coal. It never will happen with coal. Coal is big, it's clunky, it's dirty, is NIMBY, as you know, everyone know NIMBY? Not in my backyard. Because if you're a downwinder, there's acute health effects as such. But natural gas You can take have a generation facility a quarter of that size. You don't have, to make coal effective, you have to build a massive plant. And you have to build it relatively near where the coal is, which is also problematic because now we're moving to the coasts away from the hydrocarbon areas. So no one's going to build, no one in their right mind would build a coal plant because there's too much of a sunk cost and you cannot turn that around quick enough to be able to really make any money. It's natural gas. And they're small and then you could fit it quite nicely. But what's really becoming delightful is that the renewables are giving it a run for its money. And and you see it in places that you wouldn't expect it. Kansas, I know we all know you're not in Kansas anymore, but yeah, there's wind. And it actually took a German company to come in and say, das is good, yeah, wind. And basically set up this massive farm. Well, the locals thought this, my God, what weird foreigners. Until they started realizing that, my God, they're making money and we're losing money, okay, because it worked. Germany has very aggressively, and this politically is fascinating because the coalition of the SPD, and then a little bit later with the CDU, had to deal with the Green Party in Canada, but in Germany. And the Green Party in Germany had said, listen, we are single issue, and that issue is we need alternative energy paths. Let's go green. And you know how Germans are. They got to do it once, you got to do it right. And more importantly, that there's very little wiggle room. Either it works or it doesn't, okay? Well, the thing is that it worked. That the green path actually started delivering, and they did. They had a 2020 date, and they wanted to have 40% of their energy needs entirely, should we say, non-hydrocarbon renewables. Well, they had to dial it back a little bit because of other things, but they've cleared over 30%. They've had a 30% reduction since 2005 of their greenhouse gases through their going green, and they're doubling down on it. Why? It's not because they like tofu and tie-dye and Birkenstocks. It's because it makes economic sense that they can actually now generate that electricity cheaper, just right there on the dial, than with hydrocarbons, with burning coal, in their case a rather dirty brown coal, oil or natural gas. Okay? So the Germans have been a bit ahead of us on this particular thing. Other countries in Europe, Scandinavia, whatever, have been significantly far more ahead. The Danes, obviously, Netherlands, what have you, have been really quite advanced when it came to their fully embracing renewables. So this isn't exotic anymore. This is really nuts and bolts and rather you can do it without losing money. Okay. Green economic transformation also means that we have to really rethink everything as far as industry, as far as the structure of economy, and how we operate. Because as I mentioned before, just the way we are geographically distributed, that's based on cheap energy. It's based on hydrocarbons. So we have to start rethinking things. We have to think, remember, we know that the trend is toward urbanization. So consequently, you have to, as we get denser around cities, you have to take a look at things like traffic. You have to look at heating systems, cogenerations of heat as well as cooling, etc. People can be very, very clever. Subway systems provide a really wonderful opportunity to utilize the temperature in the wintertime, the thermal heat of the tunnel itself, and in the summertime, the cool. So you can actually use your subway system as a heat pump with clever enough graduate students figuring out the particulars. So cities are starting to adapt. They realize they've got a problem and that they need to rethink energy use and rethink the basic structures of cities per se. Now the other kicker, and what this is, I think one of the things that really makes this, quote, a New Deal per se, is that the previous New Deal is where the state became the employer of last resorts, CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, etc. If the invisible hand isn't going to do it as far as the labor market, let's get visible hand and let's at least get money in people's pockets so they get spending and they can start driving economic growth per se. So employment is huge. And we're in a strange situation. We've got nominally low unemployment, But what we have is a situation where you have an entire sector of the economy that is not making enough to really make a decent living. Between housing prices and lack of benefits, et cetera, there may be a fair amount of jobs out there, but they're pretty crappy jobs. And when the jobs are so good, you need 2 or 3 of them to live. Yeah, that kind of thing. Mick job is what I often refer to them as. Old jobs are dying in the hydrocarbon section. So the first thing is a kind of a normative kind of, we're all in this together. And this also was part of the New Deal. Once again, fireside chat and saying, hey folks, we're all in this together, I got your back. So people who are in these industries that are dying, they're freaked out because that's all they know. Coal country, people still thinking that coal, well, you can lie to them, give them a bunch of platitudes, give them a nice hat. But that ain't gonna bring the coal back. And they're also discovering that now that the funding for things like black lung and retirements, their pension just disappeared, okay? Promptly stolen. So what do you do? What do you do with areas like this that we're entirely dependent on it? You need a transition. And this is the interesting thing. Anyone remember some Republican congressman tried to invite AOC down to Kentucky to hang around real coal miners. We'll show that girl. She said, sure, I'm game. And they said, oh, you're actually going to come down here? Oh, we don't think so. You might actually make sense. She's plucky. But that's it. In order to transform away from hydrocarbons, you can't let those people that are going to be impacted, you got to bring them along in one capacity or another. So the idea is that you don't leave anyone behind. If you're going to sunset an industry, you make sure that those people, at least you got their back and they're taken care of as such. So the idea is that there aren't winners and winners. You want this as a win-win situation. So green jobs are it. And the fascinating thing too about things like wind and solar and retrofitting and energy efficiency, they're labor intensive. And they're labor intensive that are going to be paying at least around that 15 an hour. Okay, so that, it's a step in the right direction. It's not exactly, let's buy that second home on the Cape, but you'll be making enough to at least have a credible income. But it is labor intensive. And that means that a lot of people in that flyover zone in the Midwest, et cetera, there will be a demand for people to be able to install and into service, et cetera, these particular systems. So the idea is, and this was part of the lexicon that was used to kind of fend off any movement on a Green Deal before, is the idea is that it's a zero-sum game. You either are going to have address climate change, but that'll be at the expense of growth. You can have either jobs or you can have air. Do you want to breathe or do you want to work? Okay. Now you know that that's bogus, but it makes for good talking points, etc. But you know that setting out the kind of a false type of dichotomy there, it doesn't work. And the fact that you find that on the green side of things, more jobs, better jobs come from that, just by the nature of the employment itself. I don't want anyone in a damn coal mine. I don't know about you guys. Have any of you actually been in a coal mine? It's not a lot of fun, right? It's hot, dark as a dungeon, and damp as the dew, you say? Yeah. It's not a place to live, or certainly a place to die, but that is a place that can be replaced and with no love lost in that. So jobs are extremely important, but with those jobs, the jobs have to be, once again, pay a decent wage, have a decent benefit structure. Also with that thing to take care of the anxiety, etc. The bennies, the healthcare. Healthcare is an issue that's going to be associated with it. And also, this is the fascinating thing too, is that looking at the problems with climate, you have a problem also with income inequality too, because people that are poor are affected by climate change more acutely than people that are wealthier. If you're wealthy, you can move. You've got the ability to be mobile. If you're not, well, learn to swim, okay? Wade for it. Very much like if you looked at, during Katrina, the evacuation patterns in New Orleans. You figure the last people to leave were the people with the least able to. And Ward 9, I believe, was the deepest. I actually had a nice map of the ethnicity of the neighborhoods and the depth of the water during the flood. A positive correlation between how dark your skin was and how deep the water was. Amazing how that works. Okay. Also, we realized too that as part of a Green New Deal is that we have to take care of economic growth here. We have to reduce both carbon and greenhouse gases per se, but this isn't in isolation. And one of the other ways that movement has been derailed on climate change is to say, well, we could do it, but what about them? Oh, the Chinese are just going to clean up. If we do the right thing and they don't, well, it's their advantage, which is a really strange argument when you think about it. Oh my God, we're trying to make a better world, and if we do it, well, we're making a better world, but what? They get to win. But you're making a better world. I know, but they get to, it doesn't really work. India, obviously I mentioned before, but also China. Indonesia has major needs as far as its development. It's a very large population, and their periodic burning of forests are major problems of lung irritation and increasing CO2. You need to share technologies, but you need to be the leader on this. You need to say, hey, listen, okay, we did the first industrial revolution. We became wealthy from the first industrial revolution. But if you guys take this path, you're basically going to take the planet down with you. Okay, we benefited from that, but and you sort of have a bit of a responsibility. You know, you kind of started this industrialization game, but you can't really finish this on coal. We have to be out ahead of this, and it's amazing that it's actually been the Chinese in the last 2 years that have actually been the leaders when it comes to dealing with third world countries, developing countries, and dealing with technology transfer, et cetera. They've been able to get technologies as far as solar and wind, and be able to export that as such. So it'd be nice that we could actually take that mantle, because also too we have a responsibility. We are still the #1 producer of things. China's up there. I think we're neck and neck with China right now as far as greenhouse gases, but we've sort of had that legacy. All right. I'll add to the Green New Deal, on the employment side of things is there, but I would link this with another thing, and this comes out of the old New Deal, and that is the notion of full employment. And this has been a really fun thing that I've been kicking around this summer, is that going back to the 1930s and early 40s, and certain economists looking at the Great Depression and looking at the effects of full employment policies, a Polish economist named Mikhail Kalecki in particular used to write about full employment. And he saw that actually as a bastion against fascism. That if you have full employment, that you don't have people feeling dispossessed and angry, and that they can actually bond better with the state and aren't, say, diverted into particular nationalistic type of rhetoric, etc. Full employment's important, because there is an awful amount of anxiety around with working people. The job market has morphed from a traditional job market where you work for a company and they've got your back and there's a loyalty involved here, et cetera. There's a sort of a kind of an old type of, you're part of the family, part of this. That died. We're now in the Uber world. We're in the world of the gig economy. And the problem is that there's an enormous amount of insecurity and an enormous amount of anxiety that goes with it, because you literally are working for the gig. You have no idea where you're going to be or where you're working for weeks or even months into the future. And with this comes a huge amount of anxiety. With a full employment policy, it tasks the state to basically do that, full employment. And we have $1 trillion worth of deferred infrastructure, not even with dealing with CO2, et cetera, but just things like bridges, roads, et cetera. But you add to it the amount of policies that would have this effect. People are familiar with the kind of grid system we have as far as power in this country? It is primitive, and it's beyond primitive. And 20 years ago, people are jumping up and down saying, you have to update the grid. That energy and its production and distribution and consumption is changing, and you need to have the grid change accordingly. You have a dumb grid. You need a smart grid. And I mean, oh, that's going to cost too much. The marginal cost is greater than the marginal benefit. We can't possibly do this. Oh my. Okay, we need to rebuild the grid entirely, because now when you're starting to go a green path, you're going to have multiple sources, local, et cetera, that are going to be feeding into this. You have to rethink the electrical grid and the attachment thereof. Okay? So just the grid alone is perhaps $1 trillion project right there. Once again, we have $1 trillion of deferred maintenance as far as our infrastructure. And things like water projects, things like sewerage, but bridges and roads and just basic things like that. I mentioned urbanization, mass transit, rethinking access to mass transit is extremely important too. We have to start thinking a generation ahead as far as what this will be doing. Yes, Jill? You're starting to tap your mic. Let me see here. Oh, there he is. An unambiguous thing. Usually I get this type of thing. Let me see if I have anything else here. I was going to give you a little talk about the fact that a carbon tax, economists love carbon taxes because we're attracted to shiny things and it just makes so much sense. With the right of assumptions, it fits nicely, it's elegant. Neoclassical economists love the market. There's the fetishists of the market. And the idea is quite simple, the mantra, if you change the price, you change the allocation. So the problem that we have with all problems that face us is the problem of pricing. That energy pricing is too cheap, we use too much of it, and therefore we create the externality. The externality is the social cost that is not contained within the exchange price of the commodity. You have a buyer, a seller, they come together to agree on a unique price for, say, electricity. And that price benefits both of these parties, but it has a spillover effect on people downwind from where that is produced, etc. There was a student of Alfred Marshall at Cambridge University back in the 1890s named Pigou. Alfred. Is it also an Alfred? Cecil, I believe his name was, first name. Very British. Pigou, as in Mr. Magoo, Pigou. Pigou decided and came up with this concept of, yeah, there are social consequences to exchanges, that people who are affected by the exchange with none of the benefits, they have the costs, but none of the benefits of the exchange. This became what was known as an externality. Out of this tradition of economics, it's very simple. How do you solve a problem? You get the price right. And once again, the idea is to figure out what is the social cost. If there's an externality, evaluate it. Identify it, who's the responsible party, evaluate it, and then deliver a tax to change the relative price, higher or lower. Subsidy if you want it lower, higher if you want to discourage a behavior. Subsidy to encourage a behavior, and a tax to discourage a behavior. Get the price right, the market will do its magic, and you get an efficient allocation. Now the assumption here is the efficient allocation, of course, will be sustainable, and that will allow you to continue into the future into infinity. One of the problems with carbon taxes is that even though it may lead to greater inefficiency in markets, it's still not going to get you there as far as dealing with the bigger picture and the problem. It also is dealing with a market that's not necessarily competitive. You've got a great amount of market power, a great amount of large companies saying, oh, by the way, yeah. I don't know if people realize this, but there's an enormous subsidy to hydrocarbons. If you want to understand power, look at tax policy. And what subsidies are, in fact, too, also trade policy, it's also a series of taxes. But subsidies are just that. Within the petrochemical industry, they have a vast amount of subsidies. And the size of these subsidies alone are just jaw-dropping. Some of the most immediate things to do is to lose the subsidies. If you want to add a carbon tax, do, but take away take away the carrots first. And then you can start worrying about the stick as far as carbon taxes. Everyone, almost every economist I know, even Austrians, say, oh, yeah, carbon tax. Yeah, just because it makes perfect sense for their particular paradigm. The problem is they don't really realize its limitations. So we're down with that. Okay, you price it, you can work up carbon schemes, that's fine. But the main thing is that you are going to have to eliminate the subsidies and then attempt to get the taxes. I'm not optimistic, but it is a step in the right direction. All right, so Pigovian taxes, carbon taxes. Larger problems. Huge amounts of, let's start the questions. All right. Okay. Let's toss some questions. I've got about 3/4 of the way through here.
You didn't mention India much. American scientists just had an issue on this. And the big issue is India, who's getting hit by this, is building more and more coal-powered versions. The rest of the issue had corruption.
Oh, yeah.
Politicians, no matter what you did, they had their hands in there first.
Yeah. This is a fascinating thing. I teach a class called Modern Economic Systems, and on their final exam, they get to put China and India together and compare as far as relative merits of their economies. And one of the things about China, because of its centralization of political power within the Communist Party, is they're able, when there's a problem, to take the full force of the state and deal with it. Okay? This is an authoritarian regime. You do it once you have a problem. One of the problems that coming out of the English rule was the decentralization of authority and what became what they call that, the license raj, where every civil servant has their hand out for payola and corruption, etc. But the problem too is it's devolved into regional fiefdoms. So you can't really have a national policy on anything because the national state by design has been so weakened that it allows the regional kind of things. So if you have a corrupt regional government, they're going to do what they're going to do. They made that Faustian bargain with coal, and when that happened, it was like, oh my God, you have no idea what you're in for, do you? I'll drop the second shoe to that. They also made a policy in urban areas to build more roads to accommodate automobiles rather than double down with mass transit. So now you've got vehicle emissions on top of coal cooking into this stew of ozone and nasty over these major cities. It's really, Mumbai, Chennai, and places like that are really not. Because Chennai, I think, has just run out of water too, which is a fascinating thing because when you get that kind of heat and all of a sudden you got no water, oh my, this is really biblical stuff. Continue.
I'd like to ask what you think about the use of nuclear power. I'm aware that most of the reactors, I think, are built near the sea, so that might be a problem with rising sea levels. But it's a clean energy, and France, God, pick me up here, has a major, well, I think it's 75% of its energy.
They've doubled down.
From nuclear. What do you feel about it?
I have mixed, but the idea is, one of the things as an economist that I kind of rare is that I look for possibilities of things. What do I not know about a situation? It's the things that always get you, the unintended consequences, and things that since you have imperfect information, so you have to make decisions based on incomplete things. One of the problems that you see, and I don't know how many of you saw the series on Chernobyl, or spent any quality time in Fukushima. It's the technology itself is dangerous, and especially at a time where you've got very unsettled politics and people that are looking to inflict as much damage as possible. Nuclear waste, you don't even need a bomb, just a dirty bomb. You can take high-level nuclear waste and you can spread it, and you can create absolute chaos. Now, with that said, is that you've got, it doesn't create greenhouse gases. And especially for some folks, especially at Stanford and Caltech and MIT, but saying, oh, if you can have a smaller new generation of nuclear reactors, this could work. But you still have a problem with the waste, and you still have a problem with the security. So that's my major beefs per se. Also, the thing is that just like with coal, the plants were really expensive. And to make it work, the scale of these things. So right now, for new generating material, you need massive subsidies to do it because everyone's going for natural gas, for frack gas, with a smaller type of generation per se. I don't know. I need to be sold perhaps the next few years if they can come out with a smaller thing. But I still have that problems with the fact that if you look at people in Belarus and all the way up where that cloud came from Chernobyl, their genes have been destroyed for multiple generations. They've been genetically polluted per se. that's a problem. So I don't know where to go with it. I think that hopefully we'll have a technological solution, but I tend not to sleep on it. Yeah, I agree too. Anything that the French would probably do, I'd probably worry about. Mm-hmm.
Well, as a science writer who's been covering this stuff for decades, by the way, Amy Lovins and I used to be running around London covering science before we became famous.
Yeah.
And I wrote my first piece on global warming in about 1958-9.
It's been around.
At the same time back then, there was great concern about scientific literacy in the country. And the scientists and the educators got together and came up, as you probably remember, with these carefully designed courses and things for high school. Isn't it time that educators like you, and I know the scientific community is ready to join you, came up with something comparable for our high schools today?
Just basic literacy in things. Oh, I teach a
basic literacy in managing the planet.
Exactly. I teach, and this is a required class in any business school. You have a macro and micro. There's your microeconomics, your macroeconomics, and it's considered basic literacy, economic literacy, and that's it. That's required. But things like
high school.
Yeah, oh, absolutely in the high school, because then it gives you a context of where you can go with this thing. And once again, pardon the expression, it's not rocket science, but it is necessary. And this is something, what hit me the most coming out of the 2016 elections was that someone had made some comments about something about climate science. And one of the spokespeople said, well, that's just your opinion, to a scientist, you know? Well, that's just your opinion. And it's like, oh my God, I spent all that time suffering and that dissertation and everything just to be reduced to, well, that's only your opinion? No, okay? That's not opinions, but when you're a scientist, it's a method, and it's a method of trying to understand things. So you need to fundamentally understand what is a more solid position as far as your take on something, but also, once again, science is reproducible results. That nothing is absolutely firm per se, but it needs to be constantly groomed. But it's that process that's necessary, and to have people thinking along lines of critical thinking is extremely important. But high school, yeah.
Okay, then I challenge you through your professional association to get together with the American Association for Advancement of Science and the American Geophysical Union and similar groups and come up with a course for the high school. And I know they would work with you.
All right. I've been tasked.
Well, that's great, but we gotta do something before those high school kids grow up. It's a little more urgent than that. And you've given me this long list of totally worrisome things that I've been hearing from all directions for years now. And I was hoping that you would give me a list of things on the positive side that are happening. You know, I see a television program about how Miami is just gonna float away. We can't move a whole city. What are we gonna do? Are we doing anything to even plan about this?
It's
Give us the good side.
very good point.
Good side, Brian.
So once again, this could be such a bring down. And you come out and go, oh my God, it is such an enormous problem, and it's just we're stuck in this state of unable to do anything, stuck in the present, unable to get out of this. Here's a good one. My colleagues at UMass Amherst, at the Political Economy Research Group, Bob Poland et al., Jeanette Wicks, Lim, and a few other people. And this is from April 2019. They've worked with the state of Colorado to put together, this topic, a green growth program for Colorado, climate stabilization, good jobs, and a just transition. And I'll read you some of the highlights of what they were working on. And the idea is that on the national level, it's going to have something, but right now I wouldn't hold your breath with this bunch. So you have to start working with states, because states are going to be a little more amenable, and plus they're more, should we say, they have to deal with facts on the ground more concretely than in DC. So highlights of the main findings is, once again, promoting global climate stabilization by reducing carbon emissions in Colorado without increasing emissions outside the state. One of the dirty little secrets is that some places where you've seen countries or states reducing emissions, it's because they've outsourced the actual emitters of those things. In China, they started saying, oh, look, we have some reductions because they outsourced it to Vietnam and Cambodia. Oops, that happens. And expanding good jobs and opportunities through the state. So first thing is reducing CO2 emissions. For 2030, a 50% reduction in CO2 emissions based on the 2005 level is possible. And they would reduce 95.2 million metric tons of CO2. They're going to, and the areas, this is the major areas of clean energy investment, is one, energy efficiency. This is the low-hanging fruit, folks. Efficiency. It is so much easier to be able to take our current level of consumption and all those little things that we work with on a daily basis, make them more efficient. One of the reasons that they were early inefficient is because we had relatively cheap energy, because the price of that energy was so cheap, and we would produce a ton of energy and we'd burn it up inefficiently. But now, if you want savings and you want to reduce CO2, you can do it by just energy efficiency. Keep it in the ground, I think. I had an article at Dollars and Cents magazine about 2 years ago that at first it struck me, this is a little odd, a little quirky. It's about keeping it in the ground, that if you've got the rights, the mineral rights to a certain amount of petroleum, etc., might it be better just to keep it in the ground and buy out the rights as such? And I think that in American public lands, as far as natural resources, there would be bidding for rights to drill. And a number of folks went into and bid up the rights to the petroleum drilling just to keep it in the ground. That kind of makes a bit more sense, because that is, once again, deep sequestration of carbon. Even if you can use the technological fix of sucking carbon out of the air, et cetera, you'd have to go put it back in the mine where it came from in the first place. That seems rather circuitous. Perhaps it's best not to pull it out in the first place. And that's the other thing, is you don't have to. And I'll leave it as the last note here, is that, you know, we're smart enough, allegedly, and we're clever enough, and we can think this stuff through. And you know, it's a mistake to always rely on technological fixes. But even at the state of where we are now, we can actually head off some of the worst of this if we start really applying ourselves as such. Quick question? Yeah. I can take a question. Yeah, one more.
One last question.
One word that is not brought up is population.
Malthusian.
It is a huge problem.
Yep.
We have too many people on this planet, and at the rate we're consuming things, including energy, we need several planets, not one.
Yeah.
So we need to talk about family planning globally, not just in little places, and reducing population, and hopefully improving situations so migrations that we have now are not occurring.
Yeah. So this was talked about 20 years ago, and very little has been done on it, but now it's becoming acute because of the necessity of people having to vote with their feet. And so, yeah, this is not a problem going away. We really have to think it. There's a lot of young people today that are not having kids, and they're doing out of their reality that you really want to bring children into this situation. And I worry about that. I have 2 sons, and I really shudder to think what sort of dystopian world we're going to be living in. All right. Thank you.